So welcome back to the summit. Next up, we have Niko Skievaski. And Niko, I went down a rabbit hole when after we met, maybe a month ago, and you agreed to speak at the summit. And as I was kind of preparing my course on the science of psychedelics, I think I just like put your name into YouTube and just like a day of listening to everything you've done on YouTube. So I feel like I'm a little bit of a like freakish fangirl. Um, but it was really, really great. I'll just give the like pointer, the kind of big bullets, and please feel free to fill in. I know there's a lot I'm going to miss. Um, Niko has a kind of back history of really staying in the healthcare space. So in 2014, he, I believe, founded, but I could be wrong, a co-founder and president of Redox, which is a modern API for healthcare, and really, by my understanding, innovated the healthcare space quite a bit. Oh man, now my screen just moved. In 2020, is that right? 2023, he left Redox and ultimately, I believe, moved here to Boulder and co-founded Althea, which is a little bit of an interface or a care coordination online health platform. And I'm sure I'm botching that, so I'm going to let you fill in the holes there. Um, that helps kind of on the front end match folks interested in using psychedelic assisted therapy with providers. And then I believe on the back end helps collect data. And again, please fill in the gaps. Niko is also an extremely successful venture capitalist, which I maybe feel a little bit cringy saying, but I think that's a really important asset in so many fields, to be able to gain momentum around an idea and watch it grow is so important. And I'll maybe pause it there. I'll just say personally, I'm so, so grateful to have you. I think that you really represent the space of psychedelic medicine and psychedelic care in such a unique and beautiful way. And yeah, I'll turn it over to you with that.
Well, thank you so much for having me. As we were talking about it, we got a chance to catch some of the other speakers, and I've just been so impressed with the content. Yeah, and honored to be a part of this panel because I know some of the other folks on the agenda, and I'm like, holy cow, they're speaking, and me too. So just humbled to be here. Because I should start by saying I'm not a clinician. I'm not a researcher. I am an entrepreneur. And I'll tell a little bit of my story with that. But um, I started using psychedelics when I founded Redox, which was in 2014. Um, or I should say, I started using them intentionally. And for me, it helped to clarify what was important in life, to clarify the purpose of the company. As Brenna mentioned, Redox is an API layer, so some back-end infrastructure software for healthcare, and it's kind of complicated and behind the scenes. But psychedelics kept me pointed at what was the purpose of the software, what was the impact it was actually making in healthcare, and that trickled down into the culture of the 300 employees we had over the journey, and ultimately made a really impactful company in the healthcare space that was actually able to reduce barriers to entry for new technologies. And so something I'm really proud of. Psychedelics also gave me the courage to leave the company after about 9.5 years of being the president. And it was sort of a pointed ego death around, maybe the company doesn't need me anymore, and maybe I don't need them. And who am I if I am not Niko, founder of Redox? Um, so I was grappling with that issue in 2022 when my dad, who's pictured here in the hoodie and flip-flops, even though it was, January um, in Boulder, but that's all he ever wore was shorts and flip-flops. Um, it was right around then when he got diagnosed with cancer, and I knew that he was a stop on my healing journey that I had been avoiding, and it was a wake-up call to go and be with him and to spend time with him. And for as long as I knew him, he was a drinker and a smoker, and that had now caused a terminal cancer in him. And so I, having been a user and follower and fan of psychedelics, convinced him to sit with psilocybin. I'd been following a lot of the research on the palliative care uses of it, as well as the substance abuse uses of psychedelics. And it was actually the substance abuse side of it that convinced him to try it, because he thought if he was gonna fight his cancer, he'd have to quit drinking and quit smoking. And he never even contemplated doing those things as long as I knew him. And so that's the intention that he went into his psychedelic journey with. But I think what he really got out of it was the acceptance of his diagnosis, the courage to move into death with his head up, with focusing on what mattered in life. And that's what I saw in him and his behavior over the next few weeks after the journey was he stopped talking about treatment. He stopped talking about getting better. And instead, we went to the beach and we went to his favorite bars and we drank beers and smoked cigarettes. And yeah, and when I left him, we said goodbye. And I think we both knew um, that was the last time we would see each other. And a week later, he died. Um, and so through that process, I had an immense healing experience. Being with him, not even using the medicine myself, but just being with him through that process and seeing the impact it could make on his life. Um, and then afterwards have the opportunity to do my own work and my own journeys with different types of psychedelics to help with the grieving process. And then also with my mother, who surprised me and agreed that she would sit with psilocybin as well. And so was able to really see the impact on people who would otherwise not have found their way to this type of medicine. And it's, beyond the impact it made in my life before this with my dad and with my mom. It really showed me what it could do for people, how it could change ways we get stuck in our thought patterns in our heads. And so I got more excited about psychedelics. And as I was saying, I was leaving redox and just started studying more and more about what was going on in the space. And because of my background as an entrepreneur and as an economist, I started becoming fascinated with how to make the market for psychedelics work. Um, we're living in a really fascinating moment with psychedelics. They are being talked about everywhere. Oprah did a show on them a couple months ago. It was on 60 Minutes. New York Times just, they have articles all the time, but this is just one from last month. Um, this is the Google search results on the right there. You can see it just increasing profoundly over the last decade. And then, of course, now the NourishED Summit is talking all about psychedelics, and so it's definitely having a moment. Um, and it's largely driven based on the research that's going on at the top universities out there. Some bold researchers were able to kind of break the stigma and say, no, this is actually something that we should look at. We should dive into more. And of course, that has inspired a lot of um, oh, I should just give a quick primer on psychedelic therapy at a glance. This is kind of the general, 1,000-foot view. We're going to get a lot more into it in especially some of the upcoming presentations. But um, if you're not familiar, this is like the very quick view of it. Um, it has been shown through clinical trials and research to have beneficial therapeutic outcomes for a number of mental health conditions. And if you look across that list of diagnoses, some of these conditions are can be quite different from each other. But the theory around it is that it's able to um, really change and disrupt rigid thought patterns. And when I look at some of these diagnoses, like depression, for instance, that's often a thought pattern about the past, where you might be spiraling into negative thoughts about the past. Anxiety might be similarly, but for the future. PTSD, could be a response to bringing up past um, situations that you've been in. And so these are kind of thought patterns that we get stuck in, and psychedelics can get to that root cause by changing them. And so I'm going to let the scientists talk about how that works. I know Dr. Novick is up next, who I'm sure will go into a lot of that. But within these clinical trials, they've been shown to be physiologically safe. So they're non-addictive, they're non-toxic. There's not a threshold for most of these psychedelics that have been found to cause toxic effects. So quite safe in these controlled settings that the trials are done in. And yeah, the structure of these experiences are preparing someone for the journey with a skilled facilitator, doing the actual journey itself, and then integration afterwards to talk about what came up, and integrate that back into your way of being in the world. Most of them are done with an eye mask on, so your experience goes internal. And sometimes music is involved to give a little scaffolding to the experience. And for the beneficial outcomes that we've seen, it's often one dose. So it's within one session, which may last, 3 to 10, 12 hours, depending on the type of psychedelic we're talking about. Um, but it's one session that can cause such profound effects. And so because of that, and because of this research and within clinical trials, it inspired a lot of pharmaceutical programs. So this is very tiny, so I don't expect anyone to be able to actually read any of it, but it gives a sense of how many programs are going through the FDA process right now. So these concentric circles here, the red circle in the middle is approved by the FDA, and so there's one drug right now in this ketamine column, which is a close sister in the psychedelics world, um, is approved for treatment-resistant depression. And then this yellow band is phase 3 clinical trials, where there's a number in there, many in the psilocybin boat. We have MDMA with Lykos, of course. Um, the concentric circles outward, phase 2, phase 1. Here we can zoom in a little bit, but there are a lot of these programs. I was able to attend the 2023 American College of Neuropsychopharmacology conference, and it seemed like most talks there were about psychedelics or mentioned it. The world of psychiatry really hasn't seen many new drugs in the past few decades, and the drugs that they do have, SSRIs, SNRIs, are not very effective. We're talking 40, 50% efficacy rates for some of their conditions that they're approved for. And with psychedelics, we're seeing them really yeah, in a highly more effective. So within all these trials, there's more than 60 clinical trials that are underway right now, and half of those are in phase 3 or beyond. So psychedelics will be approved. Some psychedelic-inspired medicine will be approved in the coming years by the FDA to stand alongside ketamine, which, for Janssen, who brought S-ketamine through the FDA process, they're seeing it as one of their fastest growing drugs in their portfolio right now, with over $1 billion in sales. And so there's a lot of incentives from more pharmaceutical companies to follow suit and bring these drugs through the process. But I want to contrast the FDA process with what we're seeing with states. Um, there's another track beyond this FDA federal approval process, and that's these state regulated programs. So states are taking it upon themselves to figure out how can we actually bring psychedelics to the millions of people in our jurisdictions who are suffering today, because they've been watching the research, they've been seeing the bipartisan support that psychedelics have, and seeing it as an issue that could really help. And so, of course, Oregon was the first that went live with their program in 2023. Colorado followed suit a couple years later, which was just this summer. We had our first session in Colorado. And New Mexico just passed similar laws as well, and their program is expected to launch in 2027. And so the majority of states have considered some type of psychedelic policy. And if you'll see this map here, this doesn't follow your typical red state, blue state map that cannabis kind of followed. This is a bipartisan issue. We're seeing states like Texas and Utah, West Virginia, passing and considering different psychedelic laws to figure out how to bring this type of treatment to their populations, either populations who may have a lot of PTSD or may have a lot of substance use issues. And they're seeing this as a way to really make some ground in that. Um, but there are certainly challenges within these state programs. So we're going to spend some time later getting into each of these challenges. But they're expensive right now. They're not covered by insurance. They are on average in Oregon, what we're seeing is around $2,500 for a single session. We're seeing challenges with awareness, even though people are voting for these programs. They don't actually know that they exist when they go live. There's certainly a lot of stigma with decades of the cultural baggage that comes with psychedelics, with the rhetoric that came out of the 60s and 70s and the war on drugs. Um, and then, of course, the regulatory complexity is huge in the space, which is exactly what my company digs into. And then lots of fragmentation as well. And so, um, Brenna mentioned my company, but we are supporting about 75% of licensed providers in Colorado and Oregon, and we help them with compliance, with all the forms they need to do, with collecting payments, with probably most importantly, connecting to the actual clients who are seeking their services. And so we've seen both firsthand experience around the potential of these programs, but we also have seen the gaps that remain and some of the challenges that we're still working through. So that's what we're going to spend most of the time talking through today is how these state programs work. Here, I'll just show you the agenda. That was the kind of context setting, but I want to talk about the impact of the state programs that we've seen so far, some of the challenges with them and some of the lessons that we can take away and where it's all going. So yeah, let's dive in there. The impact of these state regulated programs. So where did they come from? These are photos of actual licensed centers where the psilocybin is being administered, probably in this very minute. I've actually had the pleasure of being in both of these rooms. In one of them, I did a regulated psychedelic journey, the only one I've done in the regulated space. But I've visited both. They both are part of our network. So yeah, in Oregon in November 2022, Oregonians passed Measure 109, known as the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act, and that was the first state really to create a legal framework for supervised psilocybin use. And it really wasn't framed as like medical marijuana 2.0. Or it also wasn't framed as a pharmaceutical pathway. Instead, it was created as a new category of supervised adult use in a therapeutic context. So quite groundbreaking as far as models go. And Colorado followed Oregon's lead. And so Chariot was the first service center in Oregon. That's what these clinics are called in Oregon, are service centers. Chariot was the first one in Portland, that is. And then similarly, the center of origin here is in Denver, and they were the first healing center approved and operational in Colorado. And so in November 2022, Colorado passed a law called the Natural Medicine Health Act. But unlike the Oregon law, Colorado explicitly allowed clinicians, like social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists and people with other licenses, to integrate psychedelic facilitation into their license. So they're actually able to both wear their, therapist hat at the same time that they're wearing their hat as a licensed facilitator in the natural medicine program. So it bridged it one step closer to mainstream behavioral health. Colorado's law also included provisions for decriminalization and eventually intentions of expanding beyond psilocybin to other natural psychedelics, although that's probably still a number of years away before the program expands. But as I mentioned, the first dosage in Colorado was given just in June, so a few months ago. So much of these learnings are what we're pulling out of our experience in Oregon, but we're trying to apply them in Colorado to really help out the Colorado ecosystem as it gets off the ground. Yeah, and then of course, just in 2024, New Mexico passed legislation directing its Department of Health to design a psilocybin program as well. That's expected to launch in 2027. Um, that the intentions around the New Mexico program are um, a little more medicalized, where there's likely going to be a need for a supervising physician. But it's sort of building on these programs and iterating upon them. And that's what I really love about the state model is that it allows us to do it at a small scale, figure out what works and how to make it better over time. And so that's a big focus of what we're trying to learn. Um, you might be asking, like, why state programs, like instead of waiting for FDA approval. And I think, waiting in there is leading a little bit because the number one reason is really urgency, in that there's millions suffering from depression and PTSD and addiction and eating disorders and other challenges. And advocates for psychedelics have argued that with the promising clinical results, strong safety signals, um, waiting a decade for FDA approval is probably unacceptable. And so we can get it out there faster. The power of grassroots initiatives and ballot initiatives, which is how it was passed in Oregon and Colorado, driven by coalitions of patients and their family members and therapists and veterans who are really demanding legal and safe options, um, got these initiatives through. Cannabis, although these programs are very different than cannabis, it did set historical precedents for a state to adopt a policy that conflicts with federal policy. So when we say psychedelic assisted therapy is legal in Oregon, it still means it's illegal nationwide. But they're leaning on that precedence that cannabis set through similar initiatives at the state level that allows that to happen. So advocates really believe that psychedelics could follow that same path. Um, and unlike the FDA models, these state programs have a much broader scope. So FDA approval will limit the usage to specific diagnoses. I made a little comparison here. Um, so a drug that's FDA approved is approved for a specific diagnosis. It requires a prescription from a provider, um, and it will likely follow the traditional healthcare delivery models that we have in our country. And it also will make it federally illegal. And so there's this agreement between the DEA, who regulates illegal drugs, and the FDA that if the FDA approves something, then the DEA must reschedule it. Right now, most psychedelics are Schedule 1, which says that they have no medical use. But once a psilocybin analog is approved by the FDA, the DEA will have to reschedule that, specifically that drug, not necessarily psilocybin at large, but that specific drug program, and reschedule it to Schedule 2 or beyond, to make it federally legal. And then, of course, payers will consider covering it. And we saw that with Spravato, with ketamine, as it was approved and distributed for depression. We're now seeing payer coverage of that, and that is really increasing the utilization of that medicine for that treatment. So in contrast to the state programs, I put little stars here next to these aspects that I think are particularly problematic for state programs, in that they're only legal within that state, which makes it challenging for businesses working in it to um, operate as a business, because so many of the business tools that are used, like payments and insurance, are federally regulated. And so it's hard for these state businesses to use banking, for instance, because they are doing something that's federally illegal, and banks are regulated by the federal government. So there's some conflicts there that make it challenging, but again, that's where cannabis has really laid the groundwork for how businesses can operate with these means. Um, these other aspects here, I think, are actually like quite positives of state programs, in that it's really novel care delivery. We're seeing a lot of innovation on the care delivery side, with how these medicines are being administered, everywhere from ceremonial practices to mimicking what's happening in clinical trials, to outdoor administration, to group settings. We're seeing in Oregon, there's some groups that are even doing yoga classes where they'll do a 25-person yoga class in a microdose, and see what happens there. So we're seeing a lot of novel care delivery aspects with it, and that is really goes along with that you don't need a diagnosis to do it. You don't need a prescription. So you can the well population, the people who are just in it for exploring their consciousness, can also be invited to these sorts of things. However, one of the biggest challenges is down here with payer coverage, in that because it's federally illegal, it is largely unlikely that we're going to see any payer throw their hat in the ring to cover psychedelics, um, at least anytime soon. Even with the huge efficacy we're seeing, and even with the potential for reduced costs because of these efficacy, um, yeah, payers probably won't throw their hat in the ring because it's federally illegal. Um, yeah, so that is a challenge that we that we have to overcome in these state programs. Um, the way that state programs work, this is largely what happens from a client workflow perspective. They need to discover, like, if they should actually do it, build some trust, figure out um, if they can find a facilitator. Um, it's a part of that market fragmentation problem I mentioned, is that it can be challenging to actually even find someone to do this with. And then once they do, their facilitator will walk them through pretty much the rest of these aspects. And so um, there's a lot of legal things, a lot of paperwork. They're going to do a screening, um, past medical and behavioral safety screenings, and um, to make sure they qualify. And then a lot of paperwork that the state requires, disclosure forms, plans, things like that. They'll do at least one session with a facilitator. That's what's regulated, a preparation session to set intentions, to talk about logistics, to discuss, yeah, to set those expectations. And then the journey itself. And with psilocybin, it's typically around 5 to 8 hours that the facilitator will be with them. And that needs to be done at a licensed center. And it's done with lab tested medicine. And so that's quite unique in that you can actually know exactly what you're putting in your body and what the psilocybin content is. Unique compared to, eating dried mushrooms, which is how most of it's done in the under-regulated space. And then, of course, integration, as I mentioned earlier, this is also regulated, so they need to have at least one integration session, but many will offer more than that to discuss what came up. Most facilitators will recommend that you spend a lot of time and space to do integration and to work with your family, to work with your existing mental health providers, to have an ongoing integration discussion. And so that's kind of the what's regulated in the journey, and that gives a lot of space to do to innovate outside of that and really figure out what's going to work best in this real world setting. Um, so that being said, digging into some of the data that we're finding, we ask people why are they well, we ask them literally this question: what led you to consider a psilocybin experience? And so you can see some of the data here. It's from about 1,000 journeys, and the top reason that 17.3% there is exploration, introspection, and personal growth is the category. So and the next biggest one, 16.6%, was for therapeutic potential. Um, and so you can see here that, the biggest reason isn't for mental health conditions. It's really for that introspection, for personal growth, um, certainly enhanced well-being, changes in perception and consciousness. This is multi-select too. So someone, with depression might be also selecting some of these other ones. Enhanced connection and empathy is that one there, 9.2. Spiritual or mystical experiences, a whole 9% are going in for that. Um, yeah, and addiction is down here in the bottom end, reducing stress, grief. So a lot of different reasons people are seeking um, psychedelics. And another interesting aspect is we ask them, where do they live? Um, and this is pretty great because what this is showing is that, yes, there's a large proportion in Oregon and in Colorado, but two-thirds are coming from out of state to and to work in these programs. And this is it's a little bit biased because Althea is probably most useful for people coming from out of state because we're really helping with care navigation and figuring out how they can find someone to work with remotely. So there's, it's probably not a perfect um, measurement, but it does illustrate that people are traveling, and it's probably those who have the means or who are really struggling who will make the means to journey west to Colorado and Oregon to do these psychedelic experiences. Um, yeah, and what we're seeing is really phenomenal outcomes. This is just so we ask at 2 weeks post journey a survey to gather information about how it went, and this is averages over about 1,000 sessions from Oregon. Um, it's going really well. This is a safety at the top. Um, it scored a 9.4. So people are feeling really safe in these experiences. Um, the enhanced well-being is kind of this lowest one here, but it's still like a 7.8. Um, the benefits that people rate to themselves for these experiences is an 8.2. We ask some of these this is what we ask in tech to see if people like your product. It's the Net Promoter Score questions. How likely are you to recommend? We ask two different ones here. So how likely are you to recommend your facilitator to a friend or colleague? Scored a 9.5, which is really unheard of in consumer research, scoring that high on these recommendation scales because you can benchmark these across other industries, and that's really, really good. And then how likely are you to recommend psychedelics in general to a friend or colleague? Scored a 9. So again, a really, really high net promoter score for these types of experiences. So yeah, it's live. It's causing real impact in the world. But there are challenges. These programs aren't hitting it out of the park. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit, into the challenges and lessons that we can take away. And I want to introduce this, the Gartner hype curve. You may have seen this before, but we talk about this in tech a lot, where there's a new tech that's introduced. You might think about like AI and the AI hype that emerged. And the general um, pattern is over time, we'll see the hype increase and there's this peak of inflated expectations. And that may have been, that may be where we are with AI right now. Everyone's like, it's going to change the world and put everyone out of jobs. And there's probably some truth to that, but it is probably hyped as well. And then over time, we sort of go through this trough of disillusionment. Love that term. It's very negative sounding, which is what it feels like when you're in it. And then the slope of enlightenment, where we learn about how these new technologies can be adopted, what their reality is in the world. And then we see a plateau of productivity where it kind of levels off and we see, oh, this is the actual impact of AI, for instance. But when we apply that to these psychedelic programs, within these markets that they're being introduced to, I would say that it kind of looks like this right now, where Oregon's a couple years ahead, and they're feeling the pain. They're in this trough of disillusionment. They might have a little more to go before they start climbing out, but that's where we're starting to feel these lessons. The lessons you learn on the downward slope as you're falling down the hill. And so we're going to get into those. Colorado is probably up here right now. In Colorado, there's this energy about psychedelics, about the psilocybin program, that is really exciting. And we're seeing a lot of, most of the healing centers in Colorado will have a waiting list where you're scheduling a couple weeks out to be able to do these experiences. And then, New Mexico, they're just talking about it. They're building it up. It's going to get there. My hope is that we can learn from Oregon and make the trough of disillusionment not so challenging for Colorado, and then maybe not even existence at all for New Mexico, because once we have enough states and the program is established enough, it might just look more like extension of existing programs rather than developing them anew every time. But an example of the trough of disillusionment in Oregon is the closing of service centers. So at its peak, we had 32 I think it was, service centers, and more than a third of them have closed already in the couple years that the program's been in existence. And at Althea, we know of a few more who are not planning on renewing their license. And so the market expanded and then contracted, and that's kind of like the hype, right? It's you see that bubble and then it bursts a little bit. So we're seeing the contraction in the Oregon market right now. The good news is the ones who are remaining are doing well. At least some of them are doing well. And so yeah, what were the challenges that Oregon felt? Um, and for me, they really emerged as barriers to adoption of these programs. And I think it boils down to these four. And we're going to get into each of them in more depth. I mentioned earlier that the cost is about 2,500 bucks for one of these journeys. Um, this is how that cost breaks down. So the majority goes to the facilitator who is spending 10 plus hours with that client. So a lot of therapists will charge sometimes 100 bucks an hour, and so you can see that that facilitator fee rack up pretty quickly. Um, the actual center itself, the clinic that they're doing it in, of course, they need to pay for their expenses, and then the medicine will cost a couple 100 bucks. And again, that medicine needs to be grown by a licensed lab. It needs to be tested and tested by an independent lab. And so that's where that cost really breaks down. There are a lot of initiatives trying to work on accessibility because it's so often that mental health struggles correspond with financial struggles. And so those who need it most may not be able to actually afford dropping 2,500 bucks on one journey. Um, so a lot of facilitators will operate under a sliding scale, which often means that they just underpay themselves, which is challenging. That's where a lot of the pain in that trough of disillusionment happens, is that many of these facilitators are struggling to make ends meet, trying to figure out how do they help more people, because I can tell you, I haven't met one facilitator who got into this for the money. They're really doing it because they, have had life-changing experiences themselves and are trying to pass that along to others. Um, of course, there's group models to try to make the cost less. Um, and there's pros and cons to groups. Some people, especially in their most vulnerable states, don't want to be in a group of strangers. Um, and then at Althea, we introduced the Forward Fund, where we collect donations and apply them to future fees based on someone's self described need. Yeah, different innovative models for it. But one of the quotes that we throw around in the space is that psychedelic therapy can be like 10 years of talk therapy in one session in terms of the breakthrough and insight that someone might gain. I've certainly felt that. Um, and that when you put it in that perspective, the cost doesn't, even though it happens all at once, the cost isn't as much, because if you imagine 10 years of paying for therapy, it's a lot more than that. So that's the one of the cost barriers there, something that is quite challenging in this space, probably the biggest barrier. Another barrier is just awareness. This is a graph from a study that our friends at the Healing Advocacy Fund administered in Oregon. And even though more than half of the Oregonians voted the program into existence, only 18% of folks, and this is actually a subset of the population who has a diagnosis of depression or anxiety or PTSD or some of the target mental illnesses, only 18% of them actually know about the program's existence or knew about psilocybin therapy. And so this is contrasted to some of the other modalities that they might look at, like talk therapy or prescription meds or mindfulness meditation. Those, we're sitting at more than 50% of people knew about those, but only 18% knew about psilocybin therapy. So there's still a lot of awareness to be gained. There's still a lot of stigma that probably prevents that awareness from spreading. So that's certainly a challenge in actually realizing the demand that is undoubtedly in the market for psychedelic therapy. Um, Another aspect is compliance. Um, and there's the cost of compliance, the real costs, as well as a lot of the hidden costs. And so compliance itself is quite expensive. It costs $10,000 a year to operate a service center in Oregon. That's just in licensing fees that you pay to the government, to the Oregon Health Authority. Um, this program is not, another way it differs from cannabis is that the psilocybin program in the government is not paid for by taxation. It is paid for by licensing fees. And so these licenses need to be large enough, and there needs to be enough licenses to actually sustain the program. And Oregon has been running at a loss, to the point where there's talks of the program that might need to shut down, because it can't cover its expenses with these licensing fees. And at the same time, the businesses in it can't make ends meet because they have to pay the licensing fees. So there's a fundamental challenge in the way that the regulations have been administered. Um, yeah, and to be a licensed facilitator, you have to pay $2,000 a year to get your license, but you also had to pay typically upwards of $10,000 for your training program. And so some of these therapists may have been operating in an underground or retreat setting with psychedelics for decades, yet they still have to pay $10,000 for training, to check the box to get their state license. And then, of course, many other costs of compliance. I mentioned insurance earlier, because of the challenging aspect of the state legality and the conflicts with federal legality. Insurance companies are really price gouging in this space right now. It's also new, so risk isn't well understood. So we've seen insurance quotes around in like $30,000 a year for premiums for certain centers. Um, within groups, we're also seeing groups need to be smaller because they are regulated as such. Um, it's harder to do outdoor administration. There's lots and lots of paperwork, and along with the stigma, there's you know, requirements around reporting and identifying clients that you're working with. Um, because it's federally illegal, because there's stigma around using psychedelics, some people will be, shy away from the legal programs because of those aspects. Um, so yeah, compliance adds a lot of costs, and we're seeing um, the barriers to compliance actually push people back into the underground, into the underregulated spaces, where they can do a lot of this a lot less expensive, um, with fewer expenses, with fewer hoops to jump through. Um, this next aspect of fragmentation, market fragmentation, this is one that I pay a lot of attention to. Um, I refer to it as the missing middle of the funnel. So in product distribution, we talk about this funnel where a consumer will learn about, like, oh, psychedelics are a thing that might help me, and then the middle of the funnel is, how do I actually figure out if I'm going to do that? And then bottom of funnel is like actually talking to the providers, doing it themselves. And there is a missing middle of the funnel in this market. If you Google, I just did this morning to see if it was still accurate, but if you literally right now just Google psilocybin therapy for depression, um, you will literally not find any provider in 19 pages of Google search results. What you do find are really positive articles from from top medical journals, from top media sources talking about the potential and the efficacy of psilocybin for depression. You'll see stories from folks. You'll see all sorts of different aspects. You'll see top of funnel content. You'll see stuff that builds awareness um, around it, but you won't actually find information about how to do it in a regulated sense. Um, so that's a signal of market fragmentation. And what that means is that the providers out there, the people who will actually sit with you, the clinics, the facilitators who are licensed to administer this medicine, they all have their own websites, but they're typically really small businesses that, maybe one or two people. They don't have the resources to actually show up in search results, and therefore you don't find their web pages unless you really are Googling some specific terms. Um, so what happens is clients are turned on to psychedelics, or potential users, potential people who could benefit from it. They're turned on to it by seeing it on Oprah or reading a medical journal article. But when they actually try to figure out how to do it, they fall into this black hole of the funnel that doesn't exist. Into this 20-page Google search result. I don't think I've ever clicked into 19 pages of search results, but I got to the end where Google said, that's literally all we're going to show you, because that's all that's relevant here. Um, in finding the right facilitator, this is kind of something that is talked about in the research a bit, but they talk about set and setting, and your mindset going into it as well as the setting that you're in within a psychedelic experience, um, is your facilitator is integral to helping you achieve those positive transformational experiences by helping you get in that right mindset, by making sure the environment is safe, by making sure that you're not distracted during the experience. And so um, it's unclear how much of the psychedelic experience is the actual journey versus the neurochemical effects, but it is likely that it is a lot of both. And your facilitator can play a huge aspect in the phenomenological effects of the psychedelics. And choosing your um, facilitator is really important. There's all sorts of aspects that I listed here on how do you actually choose it. So if you can't even find one facilitator, how do you actually find someone who can meet all of these experiences for you, meet all of these criteria for you around, someone who might not trigger you in certain ways, someone you feel really comfortable with, that you trust, to actually go into your most vulnerable states with. So, um, those are some of the challenges we see here. And so, I want to wrap up with the path forward. Like, where do we go from what we've learned from Oregon? Um, so zooming in on that trough of disillusionment in our hype curve, how do we actually climb that slope of enlightenment out? And so, what does that slope look like? And if Oregon is in that trough, how do we actually start to help Colorado and New Mexico and the states beyond climb out of it? And it really starts with these aspects here. Ecosystem trust is huge, and what I talk about with that is the existing mental health providers, un- helping them understand psychedelics, helping them build referral networks into regulated psychedelics, helping them understand the power of it and when it might make sense to refer clients into that, and how to actually coordinate care with psychedelic practitioners such that it's not a standalone experience and can be integrated into their therapy or into their other medications, or be used differently or separately than their existing medications, is a huge aspect. Normalizing access pathways. Right now, it is all happening. It is largely happening via word of mouth, is how people find access to these things. But how can we actually normalize? What is a typical pathway to access these medicines? Figuring out insurance, figuring out subsidization because it is wildly expensive. How do we actually make the cost of this care administration go down over time? And we'll see that through regulatory maturity. I mentioned a lot of the challenges with our regulatory structure right now and the cost that it imposes on this care. And so, as we see more maturity, we'll see that change. And that will hopefully come from real world evidence. And so, the more we can learn about these programs, the more we can change the programs and change policy to to figure out what policy is going to work best. Operational maturity is what we're certainly starting to see in Oregon, and what Colorado is learning from. Some of the best service center operators in Oregon have shared what they've learned and and the do's and don'ts and the challenges and mistakes they've made with the Colorado operators. I even know of one Oregon center that opened up a center in Boulder now, to really expand in the market themselves. Um, and then we're going to need to figure out some consolidation with the federal policies, because of the challenges with it being federally illegal. We're not going to see insurance payments come easily to this space. Um, we're going to have some reconciliation there, and that might be through an FDA approval pathway. It might be through other types of reform at the federal level, including DEA rescheduling, things like that. With our current federal government, it's a total wild card, I believe, on how and if and what could happen there. But I believe that with the momentum in the space, with the support that we're seeing, that we could see psychedelics as a federally recognized standard of care for both mental health and personal growth over the coming years. Um, we could see that sort of reform happen. And we certainly will see FDA approval of psychedelic inspired medicines as well, and those being integrated into your traditional healthcare delivery models um, through the existing channels that we have today, which I'm sure Dr. Novick will get into, which I'm excited to hear about, coming from those traditional healthcare delivery models. Um, so yeah, as I mentioned, Althea is really trying to become that infrastructure to help these models work successfully. Um, we are trying to help with that care navigation to establish the means for how does someone find trusted care. We have a directory. We do concierge care navigation with matching folks with facilitators. And then we also launched a fund to actually help pay for psychedelic care to help reduce those costs. Um, so for me, having my personal experiences with psychedelics, I really needed to figure out how I can make an impact in it. And it was all about figuring out the infrastructure and market aspect sides of it. Um, yeah, so I'll leave you with a couple of calls to action. Um, I think sharing your stories around psychedelics is really important to helping reduce stigma. It's what got my parents to both sit with medicine. Um, Learning about these regulated models so we know that the options are out there. And then for clinicians out there to understand um, where psychedelics might be useful and to build referral partnerships with people in the regulated space. And then on the policy side, supporting local initiatives because within 27 states right now, there are local initiatives that the public can certainly help in supporting. So that's what I wanted to share. This is a bunch of resources. So if you want to screenshot it, or we can certainly send the deck around of different aspects that I touched on today, ways to get a hold of me. Uh, yeah, and I'm happy to take any questions for the next few minutes.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If anyone does have questions, feel free to, raise a hand or just kind of interrupt or throw them in the chat or comments. Either way. And if nobody does, I've got 50, so I'll happily use up the time. Um, oh, that's yours. I was like, wow, somebody is better than me and they bulleted their questions.
That's
Um,
just what was on the slide.
yeah, okay, excellent. I'll maybe start and these are like not going for the jugular. They're very adjacent, but you mentioned that yourself personally, you've had journeys in the kind of regulated space and in the non-regulated space. And one thing I also notice is that of the two states where psychedelic therapies are deregulated, Oregon and Colorado both have strong connections to nature. And so I'm just curious, like, uh, a little comparing and contrasting. What was your experience like in the regulated space versus, maybe not?
Yeah, my the journey I did in Portland in the regulated environment was the only time I didn't go outside because where I was, the center I was in, was not licensed to have outdoor administration. And I spent a lot of it looking out the window, looking at the nature I could see. So yeah, that aspect of it was certainly not yeah, not as positive. However, what I would say is that in the regulated space with a facilitator one-on-one, they actually helped me stay more on track with my intentions. And what I noticed was that when I would be in nature, I would often just get overwhelmed with the awe and beauty of nature, which is certainly a nice thing to feel, but it's not me working on my own shit. It's
Yeah,
me
yeah,
looking at how beautiful a tree is.
yeah,
And so what I found is in a therapeutic setting, I've had kind of 10x the number of epiphanies and of insight that I would gain than in contrast when I would just take mushrooms and go out into the woods, which was certainly very therapeutic, but not yeah. I would have
yeah.
10x more with an actual facilitator who is helping to guide and remind and um, yeah, keep me on track.
Beautiful. Thank you. And it sounds like, just I'm like pulling from your response, it sounds like it is possible for centers to be licensed to administer in an outdoor setting, but maybe that's like extra costs, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, it's extra challenging because they have to have an outdoor area that they can have surveillance on. So it has to be enclosed. They have to have cameras out. And if they don't, they actually have to have two facilitators in case you run off. They can better track you down. So
Yeah.
it does increase costs to have outdoor administration. And the rules, differ slightly in Oregon and Colorado.
Beautiful. It's a shame it can't just be regulated through a church membership.
Yeah, so I didn't touch on the church model, but there are four, I think four or five churches that have gotten clearance from the DEA to use psychedelics as sacrament. So and then for every one of those, there's another 100 churches who are using that precedence as defense to to use psychedelics as a sacrament. So yeah, there are many churches who will use it as sacrament and say, yeah, we don't have explicit approval, but if we were to get raided or taken down, we would use this as a defense. And so you can find many churches out there nationwide who use psychedelics as sacrament.
Beautiful. Thank you. Alex also made a comment about unlicensed use in places. I'll just leave it at
Yes,
that.
yeah, there's a
Um,
lot. Yeah.
yeah, beautiful. I guess I'll just do real quick one more question and then we'll move it over because we're at two on the dot. You mentioned that you had conversations with both of your parents around this, and you've kind of talked a
Mhm.
little bit about the stigma and you know how that's a little bit of a boots on the ground act. So I wonder if someone is wanting to have a conversation like that and kind of broach that, do you have any suggestions? And that could be anything from like, here's what I did to like, here is a good place for resources, anything like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, from my experience, and then what I've also shared with others and have heard that it worked well. Number one is sharing your own personal experience and sharing that it's not, it's not doing mushrooms at a concert and dancing. It's well, maybe that is your experience, but
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you're trying to get someone to do it in a therapeutic setting, sharing your experience with that and the impact it had on you and what insights came up. Um, and then the other aspect is the other thing that really helped was um, Netflix, How to Change Your Mind. There's a four-part documentary series that Michael Pollan put out on Netflix based off of his book that is super accessible. And what I love about it is he highlights it is very much therapeutic focused. And at least in the psilocybin episode, which I watched with both of my parents, there's a lot of older people. So they can see themselves in the people who are speaking out on the on those documentaries. And so those were really great intros for me to be like, oh, well, let's just watch this. It's an hour long, and then we could talk more about it.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. If any folks have other questions, Nico's put his kind of contact information in the chat. You can also feel free to just leave questions in the chat and I'll pass along. Boy, Nico, thank you so much. So
Yeah.
grateful for what you're doing and grateful to have you here.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for coming out live on a Sunday.
Yeah.
And I'm pumped to catch up with Andy now and see what he's got to share. So cool to see you here.
Excellent.